today. I'm going to give it just a second or two before we get going so people can kind of roll in, and then we'll get started with our last seminar of the quarter. Who knows what time is anymore? Okay, just to be respectful of everybody's time, I'm going to get us going. Thanks for joining me for the 8th seminar of Fish 513, Cultivating Inclusive Conservation Practices. I would like to thank the university and the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, in addition to the Campus Sustainability Fund, for making this seminar possible. There has also been a lot of support for this seminar from the UW community and beyond, and I really appreciate everyone who has advised and supported and listened or watched this quarter. Thank you so much. This is the last week of public seminar talks. If you are interested in doing any of the readings, they are posted and will remain posted on the class website that is posted in the video description below. Please contact me if you have any trouble accessing any of those resources. Additionally, all of these videos will live on the SAF's YouTube channel, so please feel free to watch, rewatch, and share the work of our awesome seminar speakers. Also, just a note to folks, like before, closed captions will be added to this video just a little bit later. They will not be available in real time. So I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement and personal reflection. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, who are the first people of Seattle. I'd like to reflect a little today about how truly inspiring and powerful it has been to learn more about Indigenous communities and their sovereignty, and specifically the power of the Coast Salish peoples in this region. We've heard in class about the conservation and restoration efforts of the Nisqually, Tulalip, and Heiltsuk nations, and even the briefest sessions of Googling really highlight all the awesome Indigenous-led projects occurring in this part of the world. There are artist cooperatives like the Longhouse Education and Cultural Center that showcase and empower Indigenous artists locally and nationally. There are programs to reinvigorate the cultivation of native foods like the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project. There are projects to protect and preserve Indigenous culture like the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center. There are tribal-led housing initiatives like the building efforts of the Suquamish to provide tribal member housing. And there are far more conservation initiatives than what we could ever touch on in this class. For example, one is the Yakama Nation's cutting-edge sturgeon hatchery. So there is so much happening that it is very attainable for non-Indigenous folks to be anti-racists and help stop Indigenous erasure. So I would encourage non-Indigenous folks to look around their communities wherever you are, get informed and get involved in the activities created by the people on whose land you live and who are still your neighbors. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. Sara Breslow is an environmental anthropologist and transdisciplinarian interested in collaborating across the sciences, arts, and humanities, and partnering with local communities to address complex challenges in the human-nature relationship. She has worked to develop foundational concepts, build institutional capacity, and promote policies that advance sustainability and social justice in a variety of positions locally and abroad, including at UW Earth Lab, NOAA, IPBES, the Western Governors Association, the Puget Sound Partnership, and the Nature Conservancy. Sara holds a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Washington and a bachelor's in biology from Swarthmore College. Maggie Allen will be our other speaker, and she's an education and grants specialist for NOAA's Office of Education, where she works with aquariums and nonprofits across the country to build capacity in marine and climate resilience education. She is a BA in Environmental Studies Sociology from Whitman College and a master's in Marine and Environmental Affairs from the University of Washington. Maggie was a 2017 Sea Grant NOS Marine Policy Fellow, worked as a social scientist for NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and taught coral reef ecology in the Florida Keys. She currently lives just outside of DC with her partner and enjoys spending as much time as possible in, on, or under the water, preferably in a kayak, and hopefully if that kayak is on the water. With that, I will pass this on to Sara, who will be going first and giving her talk. Thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and it's an honor to be here and an honor to be presenting with Maggie as well. Maggie and I will be presenting two case studies today from this region, the Pacific Northwest, Northwest Washington State, in which diverse communities, including Native and non-Native communities with different values and beliefs and knowledges, face complex conservation challenges. But in my case study, I'll be presenting factors contributing to seemingly intractable conflict, while Maggie will be presenting factors contributing to successful collaboration among these communities. I'm presenting work conducted in the early to mid 2000s, but I find there's still some relevance today in reflecting on the theme of this course. And I'm an anthropologist, and true to anthropological presentation practices, I'll be reading my talk today. So settle in for a bit of story time this morning. And I'm going to dive right in. The Skagit River Valley of Northwest Washington State is the largest watershed draining to the Puget Sound. And restoring salmon habitat here is considered essential to recovering the Puget Sound ecosystem as a whole. Yet disputes over habitat restoration have earned the valley a reputation for being mired in intractable conflict. Goals of recovering salmon and protecting farmland are seemingly pitted against each other in competition for the same land. At stake are some of the healthiest remaining wild runs of salmon in the lower 48, some of the richest soils in the world, and the future of local farming and tribal communities. In its ecological, jurisdictional, and cultural complexity, the Skagit Valley can be seen as a microcosm of the American West and analogous to other places characterized by pluralistic societies and diverse landscapes. Environmental problems distinguished by such complexity have been called wicked. They are so complex, they are seemingly impossible to solve. In this talk, I aim to outline how the fields of anthropology and political ecology can provide rich insight into such problems and help conservation scientists and managers navigate their human complexities. Quickly, anthropology is the study of human and cultural diversity, past and present, and political ecology joins anthropology and geography to explain environmental problems as the interaction of local social ecological dynamics with broader political and economic forces. Most simply, the Skagit conflict concerns an apparent choice between two highly valued resources, salmon and farmland. Salmon require fresh water and estuarine habitats for breeding and rearing. Yet since Euro-American settlement in the mid-1800s, the Skagit Valley lost 40% of its upriver floodplain habitat and 98% of its estuarine habitat to agriculture and development. By 1999, Puget Sound Chinook salmon and other salmonid populations in the Pacific Northwest were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Now, environmental groups, resource agencies, and Native American tribes strive to recover harvestable salmon runs by restoring key pieces of streamside forest and estuarine marshes. However, these former wetlands are today some of the most productive and diverse agricultural fields in the world. On about 1,200 farms totaling over 100,000 acres, Skagit farmers grow more than 90 different crops, including a large portion of the world's spinach, cabbage, and beet seeds, and 3/4 of the country's tulips. Farmers worry their unique industry may be jeopardized by economic globalization, urbanization, and tightening environmental regulations, as well as efforts to restore salmon habitat on farmland. So while Native Americans and environmentalists attempt to restore lowland habitats for salmon, farmers and farm advocates attempt to protect arable land from encroachment by development and restoration. Acrimony over these apparently incompatible goals has been expressed in public meetings, private interviews, letters to the local paper, and in court. Local public discussions regarding habitat restoration largely concern its biophysical details, such as salmon productivity, tide gate design, and trade-offs in acreage. Yet this techno-scientific discourse masks deeper social, cultural, and historical roots of the problem. To understand these humanistic dimensions, I studied three central stakeholder groups: tribal, agricultural, and environmental, and asked, why is there disagreement and mistrust among these groups? Why have they engaged restoration with such passion? What is at stake in this effort to recover salmon? Whose stories are being told in public and in each community? And ultimately, why is there a seemingly intractable conflict over salmon habitat restoration in this place? I conducted 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork between 2001 and 2006 in the Skagit Valley and the broader Puget Sound region. Ethnography is the central method of anthropology. It is a process of observing while participating real time in the daily life of people. We also conduct interviews, collect documents, and interpret our findings in historically informed narratives. I interviewed more than 150 people, attended more than 50 meetings and events, and went fishing, rode a tractor, attended a tribal ceremony, and helped collect biological data. Through analysis of my notes, I identified multiple social factors explaining the conflict, including 5 that I'll touch on today. And I'll let you read these on your screen by way of a table of contents, if you will, for the talk ahead. First, my research participants disagreed on the causes of salmon decline. They did not agree on who was to blame for destroying the fish, and therefore they did not agree on who was responsible for recovering them. In interviews, tribal members and restorationists volunteered a wide range of factors, including fishing and habitat loss, as causes of salmon decline. In contrast, farmers overwhelmingly blamed fishing, and often, although not always, they specifically blamed tribal fishing for salmon decline. Restorationists understood that numerous anthropogenic pressures affect salmon, but they also noted that all major industries are already regulated for salmon protection, except agriculture. From this perspective, it seemed the central unfairness was that agriculture has been allowed to thrive at the expense of salmon. On the other hand, farmers could still remember a heyday of fishing in the 1950s. They reasoned that if habitat was converted to farmland in the late 1880s, but fishermen were still successful in the 1950s and only started to suffer after the 1980s, then habitat loss was obviously not the problem. Rather, it was overfishing. With this perspective, farmers expressed feeling unfairly punished for salmon decline. From the perspective of a tribal interviewee, the central injustice of the conflict was that tribal members could not exercise the right to fish that they had retained for giving up their land for non-native settlement. Likewise, it was obvious to tribal fishermen that tribal fishing was not the major cause of fish decline, but rather non-tribal commercial fishing and development of the tribe's former lands, which they had ceded in exchange for reserving the very right to fish. In these ways, my interviewees constructed the problem, its causes, and its rightful solutions in mutually incompatible stories. These disparate perceptions of the central problem arose from distinct realms of experience and knowledge. And now I'm going to let you read to yourself some of the quotes from my interviewees. The experience and knowledge of what it takes to run a successful agricultural business. What it takes to restore a river. And what it takes to manage a sovereign tribal nation. My interviewees would assert that others should be better educated about their respective world in order to reach a fair and effective solution to salmon decline. Further complicating things, interviewees differed in what they accepted as a legitimate form of knowledge. Both farmers and restorationists learned from science, i.e. agricultural and fisheries science, and also from place-based experience, working the land and biological fieldwork. But they differed in the weight they assigned to science versus experience. Hence, a farmer could dismiss environmental professionals as, quote, armchair experts, and an ecologist could dismiss landowners' environmental concepts as, quote, pseudoscientific. Lack of respect for each other's knowledge claims contributed to their disagreement and to their mutual distrust. Even more complicated was that axes of mistrust, disagreement, and perceptions of unfairness were not aligned. While farmers blamed fishing for salmon decline, their distrust was directed primarily at restorationists, who they perceived as urban outsiders trying to impose an environmentalist agenda on their working landscape. And I'll let you read again to yourself a quote from one of the farmers illustrating this sentiment. Meanwhile, although the local tribe's proximate contenders were area farmers, tribal members I spoke with expressed distrust of white people in general, incurred through historical and ongoing persecution. And again, I'll let you read the quote yourself. Finally, restoration advocates did not demarcate another social group as other. Rather, they expressed mistrust of people in general. They felt that since everyone was at fault in environmental degradation, everyone needed to be part of the solution. But they doubted there was a political will to recover the ecosystem sufficiently to make it habitable for both people and fish. And another quote. What was at stake in all of this disagreement and mistrust? I found it was much more than natural resources. Rather, it was the identities, communities, and moral commitments of the people who created and depended on the landscape and its resources. I observed that both the farming and tribal communities had been co-constructed with the natural resources on which they depend, such that they are place-based communities. And while not dependent on harvests, restorationists are also becoming a community that is co-constructed with the landscape it is attempting to recreate. It is clear that farmers built the farmland, and some farmers expressed painful remorse at the thought of undoing the work of their ancestors by converting farmland back to habitat. What is less immediately obvious is that the landscape also made the farming community. Its people and social structure literally grew from the unique demands of cultivating a river delta. And in the words of a local farmer, I'll let you read how he explains this. For thousands of years, Native Americans also developed a complex social system that enabled them to cope with the dynamic natural resources of the Pacific Northwest. And in the words of an interviewee, I'll let you read how he explains this. What is less recognized is that Native people also manage their environment to ensure a stable and diverse supply of food. They built clam beds, set intentional burns to promote berries and attract elk, and tended camas prairies and estuarine gardens, and they still do. Finally, while Skagit farmers narrated stories of migration and homesteading, Coast Salish people, according to Suttles, quote, tell how they were either created or dropped from heaven on the spot they now occupy, unquote. Unlike farmers and tribal members, restoration advocates did not trace their ancestry to the valley and did not express concern about maintaining their community. Instead, most commuted daily from Seattle or Bellingham or moved to the valley for their job. Yet there is an observable coevolution of community and place around salmon recovery. Most obviously, restorationists are changing the landscape by restoring habitat. But salmon have also shaped the social organization of restorationists. From mountain streams to the ocean and back, salmon transect a multitude of jurisdictions, such that their protection has mobilized an unprecedented coordination of people and organizations in the region. Restorationists discuss the significance of the valley in abstract and romantic terms as an essential ingredient for salmon recovery and the ecological health of the planet in general. As one said, "I can't imagine why you would be against restoration in general. Do you want the world to go to hell? I don't get it." And as another said, "We are fighting for the soul of the world." With such deep-seated senses of place and uncompromisable stakes, my interviewees expressed predictably different philosophies toward the landscape and its human inhabitants. Ultimately, they disagreed on who should take care of the land, who should be responsible for creating and maintaining its productivity. For farmers, it was farmers who should cultivate land and produce food. For Native Americans, it was tribal land managers who should care for ancestral homelands and revitalize indigenous identity and health. And for restorationists, it was nature herself in the form of the river. They just needed to allow her to be free. These tangled social relationships and divergent philosophies are not necessarily new or unique to the Skagit Valley. They have identifiable historical roots. They resonate with broader cultural narratives, and some have been institutionalized in governmental policies. As part of the wider conservation movement, habitat restoration reproduces the values of Western romantic environmentalism and scientific managerialism. Gifford Pinchot introduced the notion of resource conservation to curb the excesses of capitalist exploitation in the 19th century. Yet in the words of historian Samuel Hayes, such a philosophy promoted, quote, "scientific calculation of material benefit over democratic decision-making." Already by the early 1900s, what Western farmers, ranchers, and foresters had in common was, quote, "violent revulsion toward the environmental professional who in their experience had become simply a bureaucrat whose decisions a local group could rarely affect," unquote. Skagit farmers and restorationists inherit a relationship of distrust that dates at least to the early 20th century and is found worldwide. Political ecologists often observe how conservation is used as a seemingly apolitical cloak to justify social inequities. For example, it was conservation, quote unquote, of Pacific salmon that legitimated Washington state's criminalization of tribal fishing and the exclusion of Native American harvesters from an increasingly lucrative fishery. Meanwhile, as environmentalists and fishermen have been documenting the century-long decline of salmon, farmers have been preoccupied with their own drama of loss, that of farmland, reflecting a larger American anxiety about loss of the family farm as the population shifts from rural to urban. Anxiety about losing farmland, and with it, good soil, takes place within a centuries-old Western paradigm of what it means to be a good farmer. The ethic to create and farm arable land has been actively promoted by the US government through promoting white settlement, wetland reclamation as a patriotic duty, and since World War I, agricultural industrialization. A maximum yield philosophy drove agricultural production just as it did early models of resource and fisheries conservation. Finally, the tribal members I listened to evoked a story of profound loss that has already occurred. The lasting effects of losing land, people, culture, language, and spirit is termed historical trauma. The Swinomish Mental Health Project explains that treatment of the serious mental health problems stemming from historical trauma will succeed, quote, only by promoting Indian cultural identity and strengthening the Indian way of life, unquote. It should be no surprise that one of the elements most central to this way of life is salmon. At the same time, this story of loss is now coupled with a proud narrative of cultural and economic revitalization, buoyed by the tribe's growing legal and political power and a worldwide indigenous rights movement. The themes I have been discussing so far are not unique to the Skagit Valley and have been identified by social scientists as key features of environmental complexity and conflict. And I'll summarize those here. 1, social hierarchies and injustices divide local communities, and these are divisions that can complicate conservation and that conservation can also exacerbate. We can read about these social factors in books and also simply get to know local people and through shared activities in order to navigate local social divisions without contributing to them. A key takeaway is that scientists and managers are also actors in the local social order. We are also cultural beings, and it is important to reflect on how our own implicit values, including those embedded in the environmental movement and in science, may support, but may also possibly hinder our actual conservation goals. Number 3, disagreement over how the central problem is framed, different sources of legitimacy, and lack of trust between place-based communities and environmental professionals. These are all interrelated and limit cooperation and support for conservation. As you know, it's vital to build trust with local communities and listen for the cultural narratives at play to learn what kinds of knowledge and language are most effective. For example, in the Skagit, considerable outreach was devoted to explaining the ecological justifications for habitat restoration, yet rarely to addressing local assumptions that fishing was the cause of salmon decline. 4, senses of place are real and can have powerful effects on how people respond to conservation. For example, while restorationists strove to recreate a sense of wildness, farmers expressed an ethic to work the land. Projects that take land and labor out of farmers' hands may add unnecessary insult to injury, offending the very people needed to implement them. 5, environmental disputes may be the artifact of complex, changing, or conflicting governmental policies and laws. Learning about this institutional complexity can help check assumptions that resource users are simply uncooperative or uneducated about science. It could also help with coordinating across agencies and ensure that institutional structures support rather than hinder stakeholder cooperation. And finally, language matters. The dominance of technical language in conservation masks its underlying social factors. Our language needs to expand to accommodate its full human dimensions. In short, insight from anthropology and political ecology may help conservation scientists and managers work with the knowledge and skills, identities and philosophies, and needs and constraints of local stakeholders rather than against them. Ecosystem recovery requires not only the renewal of ecological health, but also the renewal of social relationships and trust, new cultural narratives, and a richer language that can capture its cultural as well as scientific complexity. Thank you. That's the end of my talk. Thank you to all of the people of the Skagit I interviewed, sources of financial support. And I wanted to share this paper on which this talk was based. Thanks so much, and I'll hand it back to Stacy and Maggie.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Maggie, if you are ready to go, then you should feel free to take it away.
Yeah, sure. I will share my screen now and get started. All right, you see that all right, hopefully?
Looks good.
Great. Yeah, so thank you, Stacy and Sarah. As you all heard, I'm Maggie Allen, and just to place myself, I currently live and work in Washington, D.C. on the traditional lands of the Anacostan people. But today I'm going to talk about my master's research that I did when I was at the University of Washington School in Marine Environmental Affairs, where from 2014 to 2016, I researched a coalition that worked together to stop a fossil fuel export terminal in the Salish Sea. So this was done about 4 years ago, but yeah, hopefully this will still be relevant today, just like Sarah's presentation. All right, so we're going to step back in time a bit as well. And from 2012 to 2015, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon faced 28 active proposals for terminals that would have shipped fossil fuels to Asia. All of these proposed export terminal projects have actually been denied today. There's some key ones I'd like to point out. The coal port terminal, the Millennium Bulk Terminal in Longview, Washington, would have been the largest coal export terminal on the West Coast after the Gateway Pacific Terminal, the one I'm going to talk about. But the Washington Department of Ecology denied them permits in September of 2017. There was also the Tesoro Savage Vancouver Energy crude oil terminal project in Washington, and Governor Inslee denied that in 2018. And I'm going to focus on the Gateway Pacific Terminal, or GPT, that was proposed at Cherry Point, Washington, which is up there, as you can see, in the northwest corner of Washington State, right next to Canada, which was just north of Bellingham and near the Lummi Nation. So the Gateway Pacific Terminal would have been built by SSA Marine, and it would have been the largest coal export terminal on the West Coast at the time. Coal producer Cloud Peak Energy wanted to ship 54 million tons of coal per year out of this terminal on about 487 vessels, originally coming from the Powder River Basin in Montana across the Salish Sea to Asia. It would have been built at Cherry Point, like I said, and Cherry Point is an ecologically important site for many species, namely a genetically distinct species of herring that's actually been declining since the 1970s, but it contributes about $3 million a year to the Lummi Nation fishery. And to protect this species and others, Washington State Department of Ecology has designated it as an aquatic reserve. It's also a very important cultural site for the Lummi Nation. It's originally known as Zuishi Zen, and because it contains dozens of archaeological resources that date back to almost 10,000 years and ancient reef net sites as well, which is the largest of its kind in Washington State. It's also a very heavily industrialized landscape. It currently has 2 oil refineries and an aluminum smelter on the site. So it's actually not owned legally by the Lummi Nation. As you can see in this picture, the Lummi Reservation is quite small. It was taken away from them a bit of, I think, in the 19th century from a dispute. So they don't actually own the land itself. And it's a very industrialized landscape, which was one of the arguments just to build it there anyway. And there were, of course, many other views on both sides of the argument. Proponents cited mostly job creation and tax revenue. There were various figures about that. 430 direct jobs was a statistic that was cited often, as well as 213 new jobs at build out and creating about $10 million in tax revenue, mainly by labor and organizations like the Alliance for Northwest Jobs and Exports. The Crow Nation in Montana also supported the project because the coal is on their land, so they would have benefited economically from that. And you can imagine the various things the opponents cited, like potential for oil spills in the harbor, vessel noise and impacts, harmful shoreline development, excess coal dust, carbon emissions, that it would destroy Lummi's culture and ecological sites, and namely that it would block the access to the Lummi Nation's fishing grounds. And spoiler alert, the US Army Corps did deny the permit on May 9th, 2016, and the developers withdrew their permit application in February 2017. So this terminal did not go through. And I will note that the whole time I was pretty much writing my thesis, I did not know this was the result. In May 2016, I was putting my final touches on my thesis. So I got to add this at the very end of my research, which was exciting. But throughout this research and pretty much everything you'll hear today, at the time I did not know, we didn't know that the Army Corps was going to deny it, so. All right, so before getting in deeper about the coalition itself, I think it's important to understand more about the Lummi Nation and their fishing history. to understand why most members oppose the terminal. So the Lummi Nation are known as the people of the sea, and they depend heavily on fisheries for their livelihood. Prior to white contact, the Lummi's most common economic activity was reef netting. And then in 1855, the Lummi signed the Treaty of Point Elliott with the US government, which stated that Coast Salish tribes had the right to take fish at their usual and accustomed fishing grounds. Although it did give a large portion of Western Washington for non-tribal settlement, it also assured land and fishing rights to the Lummi and other Coast Salish tribes. However, the Lummi were still pretty much left out of political and economic decisions of Washington state fisheries up until the mid-20th century. And then along came the Bolt decision of 1974, which further strengthened the Washington tribe's self-determination and the right to fish. And this, of course, was where the Supreme Court granted the Lummi Nation, as well as all 20 other Washington indigenous nations, 50% of their catchable fish. So today, the Lummi Nation have the largest native fishing fleet on the US West Coast. They have about 21,000 acres and 5,000 citizens, and 78% of the citizens live on or close to the reservation. And the Lummi harvest many species. 90% of their fisheries are commercial, and Cherry Point is actually one of the most common fishing areas for the Lummi to use, particularly for salmon and Dungeness crab. All right, so now I'm going to get into a little bit of the coalition, which of course was led by the Lummi Nation in this fight against the Gateway Pacific Terminal. And the other groups that were involved were many environmental organizations. And this picture here is not going to show every single environmental organization that was involved, but mainly the ones that I talked to are the ones that were like most closely involved with the Lummi Nation. So these groups' relationships with the Lummi mainly began in 2010, when a few of them approached them asking how they could help stop the coal terminal. So for example, the Lummi Nation talked to the Sierra Club and said that they needed a better way to communicate their concerns. So the nonprofit developed material to tell how the Gateway Pacific Terminal would affect the Lummi's way of life. And there were also a few more local nonprofits involved: Climate Solutions, which is based out of Seattle; Resources for Sustainable Communities, which is a Bellingham-based nonprofit; and then a coalition of many nonprofits called Power Past Coal. And there were also some faith-based organizations involved in this coalition, namely the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship, which actually began their relationship with Lummi back in 2007, when a church leader there helps them with their global canoe journey and acknowledged them officially as the original inhabitants of the lands. And then in 2012, the Unitarian Universalist Association nationwide, or internationally maybe, officially stated they were standing with the Lummi Nation against the Gateway Pacific Terminal. And then there was also a group called the Earth Ministry, which is kind of a mix of an environmental and a faith-based organization. And they worked to train faith leaders and held events where the Lummi could talk about the GPT. So I'll also give a really quick overview about what the advocacy was that was against the GPT. A really big event was started when in 2011, SSA Marine gave the Lummi a $400,000 check that would help with their technical review of the proposal, but this only really furthered the Lummi's opposition to the project. And in response, they burned a fake check that was given to them by SSA Marine in 2012 that basically said that no amount of money would convince them to allow the building of the coal terminal. You see in that picture, it says non-negotiable. Another really big event was the totem pole journey. And from every summer from 2014 to 2016, this journey brought together indigenous tribes from the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest with an aim of sparking awareness and dialogue about the environmental and cultural impacts of fossil fuel development in general. The totem pole traveled from South Dakota to the Salish Sea and all the way to the Alberta tar sands. It was around 20 feet tall, and it was just a symbol that united communities whose lives intersect with the coal exports and the tar sands. And even today, at least a couple of years ago, it's still being used to address other issues. A couple of years ago, it traveled all the way to Miami to protest the captivity of an orca whale at the Seaquarium down there. They wanted to bring that orca whale home to the Salish Sea where it was captured, I believe in the 70s. So it's still being used in other fights as well. So other advocacy events against the GPT were just various events and forums and workshops and film festivals. The Lummi wrote hundreds of pages to the Army Corps of Engineers asking them to reject the project and recognize their treaty rights. And I also want to take a further step back and recognize that Indigenous environmental alliances are happening all over the world. And globally, Indigenous people are on the forefront of resisting natural resource extraction projects, and they're playing very active roles in social movements that are fighting this exploitation. They are asserting their rights and demanding recognition for their roles as stewards of the land and waters. And many environmental organizations are starting to realize that Indigenous people are active organizers of these social movements. When I was doing a literature review of these Indigenous environmental alliances, it really emphasized that these alliances have the potential to reshape the environmental movement and create history and possibility of a new world. They're a place that can create an opportunity for Indigenous groups to voice their political opinions, share their resources, and strengthen their self-determination. And common environmental concerns and similar identities can bring people from different cultures or races together. However, of course, during these relationships, there are often different worldviews and interests that don't always act in the best interest of Indigenous groups, and there's often issues of distrust and control. So it's really important that in these alliances, there's an equal sharing of power and decision-making, that non-Indigenous organizations strengthen the political power of the Indigenous groups, and that there's a sense of common understanding and a common agenda to negotiate group differences. So knowing all of that background, I approached this issue by wanting to know how the goals and desired outcomes really differ between the groups, how the coalition's policy tools and resources helped the Lummi successfully block the GPT, and then also what are the group's different levels of power and how this may affect the policy process and the overall relationships between the groups. I also was hoping to highlight issues of environmental justice within the policy process and social movements. So I approached this issue using the Advocacy Coalition framework, and I won't go really into depth about what this framework talked about, but just in general, the framework states that coalitions form when members with same policy beliefs want to achieve a particular policy goal. So even if these people and organizations have different interests, they are united and conflicts can be mediated by their similar overall belief. These coalitions can help gain the attention of policymakers because the members can come up with effective strategies to engage other stakeholders. So the framework also states that people are motivated by mainly two different kinds of beliefs. That's deep core and policy core beliefs. So deep core beliefs are things like religious beliefs, and they're very hard to change, and they generally describe a person's deep-seated perspective on the world. Policy core beliefs, however, are still specific and hard to change, but these are the things that really unite allies and form coalitions. And so this can be an organization or a person's belief on education policy, for example. The framework also states that there are 5 degrees of resources within a coalition, and that's finances, leadership ability, access to authority, access to scientific information, and the ability of members to organize. And these 5 degrees of resources can also vary across the different groups within a coalition, but having these resources help them engage with others to achieve the overall goal. And for today, I'm just going to talk about the access to authority or access to power resource. All right, so I did my research using community-based action research, which is where I basically went to the Lummi Nation and asked them what they wanted help with instead of imposing what I thought would be best for the tribe and the issue. I actually did have a different idea to research this issue asking entirely different questions and using an entirely different approach. But when I went to talk to someone, a key informant at the Lummi Nation, he basically said, no, please don't do that. We really want to know how the organizations we're working with, how this is effective at our coalition, and how we're utilizing each other to be successful in this fight. So I decided to focus on that instead. And I did snowball sampling. Where I talked to one person and then found another contact and so on, and kind of went from there. And I did about 12 semi-structured interviews. I interviewed Lummi activists, and those were in person and a little more conversational. And then I also talked to people at the environmental and faith-based organizations, and those were more structured and tended to be over the phone. I couldn't talk to those people in person, and they were just a bit more formal. So I also went to many events and gathered information about the GPT and the coalition there. And I read various relevant news articles and analyzed documents such as public comments and other official documents. So once the interviews were complete and I transcribed them and I manually coded them, and I looked for keywords and themes, and then I identified those themes that were emergent from the data. And then I checked in an iterative way the degree to which they matched the Advocacy Coalition framework, and I addressed gaps in the theory based on that qualitative data. All right, so some really quick results here. Overall, each group have various different deep core beliefs, but as I said, they all kind of united around their very similar policy core beliefs. And overall, that was a strong desire to stop the coal terminal. And they were all very concerned about climate change and the environmental justice implications of the terminal. So the Lummi Nation, for example, had a deep core belief of heavily concerned about their treaty rights violation and the sacredness of the land and fishing. They're also very concerned, however, about climate change and the impacts to their community that the coal terminal would bring, and what it would do if they built a terminal on their ancestral site and impacting their fishing grounds. So the church groups see a strong importance of spirituality for human well-being, and they really viewed the rejection of this terminal as a vital human rights issue. So they saw the terminal mostly as a moral wrong, something that just shouldn't exist because it was an environmental and social injustice. Some people of those groups did directly say environmental justice, mainly the ones that were also more environmentally focused, like those at Earth Ministry, but others simply said it was just a moral and ethical right to reject the terminal. And then, of course, the environmental groups are more traditionally concerned about, well, environmentalism, ecosystem preservation. However, they are mostly also moving to incorporate and be concerned with environmental justice and climate justice. And so many of them were also very concerned about that as well, and not just the ecosystem component. And then in terms of access to authority, this case study was really unique because it showed a relative balance of power within the coalition. And actually the Lummi had the most power due to their treaty rights because they had the legal power. Their rights under the Bolt decision and the treaty of Point Elliott reasserted their right to fish. The Lummi's direct authority and tie to the federal government as well allowed them to assert their sovereignty and establish a leadership position amongst non-tribal communities. And the environmental groups mainly had the people power because they had the ability to reach many different people, especially the Sierra Club, which had a national reach. They were able to use a variety of policy tools, such as hosting forums and workshops, writing comments for the environmental impact statement, scoping process, writing letters to Congress and Army Corps, coordinating events, providing a grassroots push. For example, the Sierra Club sent out over 25,000 personal letters to Congress asking for the rejection of the coal terminal. And the environmental groups also kind of had a little more access to scientific information and provided technical assistance. And the churches had the political power. They had the ability to influence members of Congress, had the strength of the political power of Christianity. An interviewee was quoted saying, "Faith is present in every single congressional district in the United States." And they also brought additional resources, such as holding space and connection to other groups of people as well, who maybe otherwise would not have known or been as concerned about the terminal if they weren't involved. All right, so overall, the coalition was very successful at developing strong relationships between the Lummi Nation, the environmental organizations, and the faith-based community. And throughout the interviews and events I attended, members of all three groups stated the importance and optimism that they had in the alliance. Many specifically pointed out the totem pole journey as being a very symbolic activity that started a trend that recognized the importance of these types of campaigns and the necessity of creating alliances to achieve change and gain followers. And many stated from the very beginning, even before the Army Corps rejected the proposal, believing that the coalition is a very effective way to impact the policy process. And although the Army Corps, I did send them an email and they couldn't officially state the coalition or the constant pressure had anything to do with their decision, they did state it was just because there was that legal issue of blocking the traditional custom fishing grounds. Many of the people I talked to strongly believed that the Army Corps would have approved the project if it weren't for the constant advocacy from the alliance. And so I wanted to end with a few quotes from Lummi activists and environmental activists, people stating that it's not about coal, it's about people coming together. The people gathering creates the sacred movement. An environmental activist said that we need each other. The tribes lead the way and we support them. They can't make it without us, but we can't make it without them. And then Jewel James, who was a Lummi Nation activist during the whole event, stated at a public event, "We're glad that the citizen groups, the non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, and the churches have all come together. United, we can work and win." So yeah, in conclusion, this movement illustrates how a tribe's treaty rights enable them to really affect the policy agenda in a way that other groups can't, and also help level past power imbalances among various groups. Coalitions like these have the potential to improve relationships between environmental, faith-based, and indigenous groups as they work towards ecological justice. And it also showed that issues like environmental justice and climate change have the ability to unite historically opposing groups and form successful coalitions. It also demonstrated the various steps taken to gain momentum and mobilization over a widespread issue. And I'm hoping that my research was able to enhance other research on policy core beliefs within and amongst cross-cultural coalitions that are working all over the world to fight fossil fuel extraction projects and similar projects. And I also wanted to end that it's 2020 now. Of course, it's been 4 years since I did this research. And although I've moved away, I'd really like to go back to this project and learn, if this coalition has actually been successful 4 years later, and if these groups are still working together to help each other through other major challenges like COVID. So, this is still an ongoing issue. Of course, there's still climate change and still other projects that are threatening indigenous people and their ability to access their fishing grounds. So I'd like to continue to check in and see if these coalitions are still effective because it was so effective 4 years ago. So with that, that's my presentation. I want to thank my thesis advisor, Dr. Nevis Dulsack. Sarah was also my co-thesis advisor. And thank you, Sarah, for helping out with that, as well as inviting me to today's seminar. And of course, to all the Lummi Nation activists, informants, and allies, and the environmental and faith-based participants I talked to during my research. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Maggie. Both of those talks, Sarah and Maggie, were awesome. I think that ties together the seminar very nicely. Let's take a question for each of you. I think we have time for that, and then we'll jump to the class portion. So to start us off, Sarah, there's a question for you. How can scientists overcome the barrier where they view the scientific method as potentially the only valid form of knowledge? That's a major hang up about bias and intuition in there.
I love the question. At least it acknowledges that there's a dilemma. I think it's a huge question. So I'm trying to think on my feet quickly here. I often come back to the universities themselves. We are so impressionable as young students, and our view of the world can be shaped very significantly by our undergraduate classes and experiences. And I think that's a key opportunity for those wishing to expand beyond this notion that science is the only legitimate form of knowledge to including other additional legitimate forms of knowledge. So, I think the classroom, making sure that environmental science curricula are diverse in the knowledges that they present is super important. So that's one concrete thing that those of us on the call may be able to do. Beyond that, I think if folks are themselves questioning science, perhaps myself, I was an undergrad in biology and was being taught basically that science is really the best way of knowing. I had to find my own pathway to start questioning that and start adding additional types of knowledge, understanding. One of the fields that I thought was really helpful was science and technology studies. So if anyone's curious about understanding how science itself is a product of history and culture, we can turn to the social scientists who study science itself as a social phenomenon. And I think that's a nice stepping stone for scientists who want to have very well, empirically and theoretically grounded reasons for walking across a bridge out of science and into other ways of knowing. So looking at science and technology studies and also the whole field of philosophy, I think can be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Maggie, a question for you. From your work, are there dynamics you noticed that help keep Lummi interests at the center of the coalition? Really helped ground that there.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, for sure. So from your work, are there dynamics you noticed that really helped keep the Lummi interests at the center of the coalition and help ground the movement around that?
Yeah, I think the key part was that everyone I talked to really at the very start recognize the Lummi at the center of it, and both because of their treaty rights and their physical location and their commitment to it, because they were the first ones to really publicly state they were against the Gateway Pacific Terminal. So they really helped draw attention to the issue, like you said, by burning that check, by publicly stating that they were against it from the very beginning. So I think then the environmental groups came to them, and they never really tried to co-opt the issue. They always seemed to recognize the Lummi were at the forefront of that. They probably did recognize their legal treaty rights gave them that power in a way that the other groups just didn't have that leverage. So I think they, every group involved recognized that the Lummi had that power, and also because the Lummi were at the center of every fight at the forefront.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maggie. YouTube is thanking you by and large for your talks and fantastic presentations. I think we are going to jump over to the class portion, but I want to take the opportunity real quickly just to say thank you so much, Maggie and Sara, for talking with us today. And thank you, everybody that's been watching on YouTube. I really have appreciated your participation in this seminar series. And I hope you all have a good rest of 2020. Thank you.